one of the things that we need to talk about if we're going to talk about crime rates is what influences those crime rates. So you can check out some of my other videos where I talk about sort of how we measure crime and how we come up with these numbers. But then it's important to sort of know about what influences those rates. Once we actually have those numbers, where do those come from and what are some of the things that influence those? So one thing is what's just called the ecology of crime, which essentially looks at patterns that are relevant to temporal and ecological factors. So, for example, crime happens much more often during the summer months. We know that. This is a pattern that we found. And when you think about why that might be, well, there are more people outside during the summer, and so you have, more interaction with other people, and houses are left unattended more often, things like that. Also, teens and young adults are out of school, and young people are a very high risk for offending, so that would also increase those rates. Also, the hotter weather, which sort of here's where heat ties in. Generally, heat increases crime. So people, and it kind of ties in with, summer. But also, heat makes people, become agitated more easily. There are sort of multiple things where kind of heat comes into play, but then it's actually only to a point, because there is a point at which it becomes so hot outside that you don't want to do anything. And so it drives people back inside, which is similar to when it's cold out and everybody's inside. So there is sort of a point where it kind of actually comes back down. But then there's also general regional differences. So there are definitely some differences between urban and rural areas. So we know that urban areas see more crime. And it's not just because of the higher populations, because even accounting for population, it's still urban areas see more crime. And I mean, part of this is because you have more people in a smaller area, so you have higher concentrations of people. Also, you see higher levels of diversity and heterogeneity, which means that people will not get along as well, and so there's a higher likelihood for conflict, and also higher likelihood for victimization, because if you're not going to steal from somebody that you know or somebody that you like, but it's easier to commit a property crime against somebody if you can say, well, they're not like me. So that's why we're going to why that's going to kind of have an effect there. Also, we see more violent and property crime in the southern states, and to a lesser extent in the western states compared to the Midwest and the Northeast. There's lots of sort of potential explanations for this. There's explanations regarding things like culture and also the how many large cities are in these areas and how spread out the population is, things like that, that are going to have an effect. Something else that is relevant is the use of firearms. So it is undeniable that guns play a significant role in crime, especially when we're talking about lethal violence. So guns and the lethal violence they cause has been said to be the single most significant factor that separates the crime problem in the U.S. from the rest of the developed world. So there's no other place like America in the world in terms of the amount and the availability of guns. So this absolutely affects the crime rate. It, guns, especially handguns and pistols, are linked to homicides. So there's like a large proportion of homicides are committed with guns, and also suicides. There's a large portion committed with guns as well. So, and there's situations where an otherwise non-lethal situation becomes lethal when you add in a gun. So there are factors like that just play in. And I mean, obviously there are debates about gun control and sort of what we need to be doing and whatnot. But certainly, I mean, people like to put forward the idea of guns being used for self-protection, although research that has come out in the last couple of years has shown that guns are used for sort of either homicidal or non-protective purposes, like at 6 times the rate of any time it's used for self-defense. So we have to take that with a grain of salt. But regardless of what the debates are about, it is undeniable that guns are related to crime in America. And certainly they are an exacerbating factor. And that is true regardless of kind of where you sit on the gun control debate. And that is where we are going to leave that for now. So something else that influences crime rates, socioeconomic status. We know that there is a relationship between poverty and crime. And so official crime data shows the most serious crimes are committed by the lower class and in lower class areas at much higher rates. But the less serious, and if you look at self-reported crime, it's spread a lot more evenly. So maybe there is a bias there in terms of the justice system and sort of who is targeted by the justice system. But it is still the case that when we look at official data, poverty is a factor. Poverty definitely affects psychological well-being. It increases strain. It affects family disruption. It's associated with decreased adult supervision of youths. So there are a lot of factors that play in here. But there are two kind of types of violence that we see. So instrumental crimes, this is where people are going to be trying to compensate for the lack of some legitimate economic opportunities. So they don't have access to these opportunities, and so they try to make up for that lack of access through criminal means. And so the violence then is used to, violence or property crime, but it's used to improve the financial or social position of the offender. So there is essentially a purpose for the crime, and they're committing the crime to get something that is going to help them in some way, whether that's getting access to something that they otherwise wouldn't have access to, like something tangible, or it could be something like just, saving face or getting some kind of respect that they otherwise don't have. But there is some kind of reason for it. As opposed to the expressive crimes that happen that are just crimes with no purpose except to commit the crime. So crime for no sake but crime itself. And these come from the result of emotions. And so typically anger and frustration, which often is deep-rooted in an anger and frustration against society. And then it comes bubbling up with, the whatever straw that breaks the camel's back, so that there is some kind of explosion of emotion, and then that results in some kind of crime. And of course, that is going to be exacerbated by alcohol and drug use and abuse, and because that makes it so that people are more likely to show their emotions. And so if they have these underlying negative emotions, those are the ones more likely to be shown. So certainly potentially relevant factors there. Age, very important variable here. This is the age crime curve, and we have the nonviolent curve kind of up here and violent here. So violent crime, of course, we know happens at a much lower rate, so that curve is going to be lower. But also you'll notice the peak of nonviolent crime is hovering more around the age of 16 or so, whereas violent crime is a little bit later and the peak is closer to like 18. But what we see here is that we have this sort of increase and a peak in young adulthood, and then a precipitous drop, and then that drop continues as people age. So it is a very natural progression that any offender is going to age out of crime, which means that they are committing less crime with age. Doesn't mean they stop, often, but not always. But it's a very predictable pattern that people are going to commit less crime with age. This is actually speculated to be the single most valid and consistent predictor of criminality and recidivism risk. So if there is one thing, if you could only choose one variable about a person, one thing that you know about a person to try to determine if they are at risk to reoffend, if we're talking about like recidivism risk assessment, age is the single most predictive factor. So of course we use more than that when we're actually doing risk assessment, but that is the single most predictive factor because people always decrease their crime commission with age. It has been shown again and again and again. A big part of this is when we look at like responsibility that increases as you age, with commitments that adults have that kids just don't have. So commitments like career commitments, family commitments, so getting married, having kids, and not being out with the boys all night anymore, and things like that. those absolutely play a role. And also there are also physical limitations that come into play once you reach a certain age. So, maybe when you're in your 50s, you can't scale to the second floor apartment building to break in when you were able to do that in your early 20s. So there are things like that there's a physical limitation that suddenly limits possibilities, at least. Gender is also relevant. So we know that males commit more crime of all types than females. The female rate is steadily rising, but we do know that males still commit more crimes, especially when we look at violent crimes and absolutely sex crimes. So there's been sort of a lot of potential reasons for this, one being emotional factors. So there are some gender-based traits sort of that when we look at emotional development where females are typically more empathetic and nurturing. There are also differences in physical capabilities where men are generally physically stronger and more capable of violence compared to women. And remember, these are just patterns. This doesn't mean that every man is associated with how males are defined here, and every female is associated with how females are. These are overall general patterns that are going to explain the overall pattern of crime. So there's also hormonal differences that kind of play into some of the physical differences. So even just straight up, we're looking at androgens, especially testosterone. Obviously, men have higher levels of that, so that has been shown to be linked to crime, especially violence and impulsivity. There's also socialization differences. So girls in society are taught to be less aggressive. They're also supervised more closely than boys at a young age, so that's going to play into it. Then there are also cognitive differences, where girls tend to have better verbal skills at an earlier age, and boys have better visual spatial abilities. And so that may play into that idea that girls are better able to talk through a problem, and boys get physical a lot easier. But that may be more culturally dependent than actually gender dependent. So there is that. There's also what's called the Masculinity Hypothesis, and this was put forward in 1895 by Cesare Lombroso, so keep that in mind. But he basically said that, okay, there are some females that commit crimes, but crime is a male thing. So the females who are committing these crimes are the more masculine females, and they're the ones responsible for the handful of crimes that are committed by females. But crime is a masculine thing. So that was what Lombroso said. Not sure how much that holds any water anymore. But then we also have what's called the Chivalry Hypothesis. And this is the idea that females are not committing less crime so much as they are committing crimes and they're more likely to get away with it because female criminality is hidden, because we have this cultural need to protect females. And so police are going to be less likely to arrest females. Juries are going to be less likely to convict females. And then judges are going to be less likely to imprison females and to basically give them lighter sentences. So while this may hold some truth, which may be that this is lessening a little bit, especially when we see the increase in female criminality. But, maybe that can explain some of this difference. Race is also relevant because we know that minorities are involved in a disproportionate share of criminal activity. And so there are three possible biases that can explain this. And the first is that there's a system bias. So this means that when we look at self-reported delinquency and self-reported crime, there is almost no relationship between crime and race, meaning that delinquency and criminality rates are similar across races, but minorities are getting arrested more often and treated more harshly by the criminal justice system. That's probably not a surprise to anybody, but that is absolutely a major bias that's at play here. There is also a cultural bias, and this is where we look at the early American cultural experiences, most notably slavery, has shaped the current society, where we now have certain groups that lack opportunities that are forced into dependency, and then that, of course, is going to result in less opportunities and also more antagonism towards the system. So there's that. And then there's also a structural bias where there's actual economic and social disparity that comes from things like employers being less likely to hire minorities. Minorities are more likely to be economically disadvantaged because of that, which of course we know brings its own challenges because of all of the relationships to poverty. And they're also more likely to live in crime-prone areas and impoverished neighborhoods. So those are going to add on to the hurdles that they're already encountering in the system. So something else that influences crime rates is immigration and crime. So immigrants are far less likely than your average U.S. native to commit crime. So this is definitely contrary to the public perception that illegal immigrants are dangerous and violent people, and areas that house immigrants will see a spike in crime rates. It is absolutely the opposite of that. Having higher rates of immigration in neighborhoods is a protective factor because we see less crime committed by those individuals, and we see less crime in areas with higher proportions of immigrants. And so there are lower rates of both incarceration and institutionalization of any kind. And so there was a just example of one study looked at counties that neighbored Mexico. So this was a study done in Texas, compared to counties that were non-border counties. And the counties that neighbored Mexico had a higher proportion of immigrants in those areas, and they had lower homicide rates. So that's just one example, but it has definitely been found that immigrants are far less likely to commit crimes. And if you think about why this might be, whether we are talking about legal or illegal immigrants, they typically have more to lose if they are apprehended by the criminal justice system with potentials for deportation and things like that. So they typically are more aware of what they're doing and more sort of cognizant of the possible ramifications should they be caught for any criminal conduct. I know this as an immigrant myself because I am a Canadian living in America, and I know that you keep your nose clean, and because you don't want anything to happen that can affect your family or whatever. So there certainly have been higher rates of crime amongst U.S. native populations, meaning anybody who is a native-born U.S. citizen. So immigration then is a protective factor. And something else that influences crime rates are the chronic offenders. So these are people that have lengthy criminal careers and are basically committing a lot of crimes within their lifetime. And so these are individuals that are causing a lot of damage. So this sort of came up for the first time officially in a study in 1972 by Wolfgang, Figlio, and Selin. And that's their book here, Delinquency in a Birth Cohort. And basically they had a sample of just under 10,000 boys. They had 9,945 boys. And they found that 627 of those boys made up the chronic 6% who had each been arrested for 5 or more crimes. And so this chronic 6% has actually been supported many times over. It's always around that number, that around 6% of the sample that tends to represent more than half of all offenses committed by the sample. So if we look at this sort of is extrapolated to the population, that about 6% of our population is committing over half of all crimes. And so the rest of the crimes then are committed by people who are committing one offense, one-time offenders, first-time offenders, things like that. So this then represents a group that we want to know more about. We want to be able to prevent crimes from happening within this group, because then that's going to have a bigger impact. If we can make one of these offenders desist, that has a large impact compared to if we have a one-time offender who is already not going to commit more crimes and we focus on them. So this chronic 6%, although it doesn't mean that we don't focus on other offenders as well. This is just sort of the chronic 6% is a group we want to focus more attention on. It's interesting because arrests don't deter chronic offenders, so they keep getting arrested and they keep committing crimes. So we have to come up with something else to deal with these offenders and make it so that they can become productive members of society again. So the causes of who becomes a chronic offender, there's been some research done on this, tends to be early onset. So we have people who are starting young, which makes sense because the earlier you start, the more likely you're going to have a lengthy career and the more likely you're going to have a more varied career in terms of criminality. So kids then that become chronic offenders, when they're kids, they tend to have a variety of personal and social problems at an early age. So then they're already at risk. And so chronic offenders, though, also there's problems in the home and the school, so they tend to see more violence in the home and crime being committed at home. Parental drug use also, we're going to see that, which sort of ties into the problems at home. They don't do very well at school, so they're more likely to be failing at school or having trouble. or just not showing up. They're also more likely to be arrested at an early age, which ties into this early onset. They tend to have a lower IQ and low intellectual development in general, which could also play into sort of a, like communication breakdowns and things like that. But whatever the causes may be, this group does represent a group that we want to focus a little bit more attention on and kind of try to figure out how to deal with them. But the sort of all of these things kind of work together, and sort of there's a lot of overlap in terms of influencing the crime rates, but there are a lot of things that factor into what makes up those final crime rates that we end up examining and trying to really figure out those numbers and then figuring out how to try to use those numbers. So there's a lot of things that go into that.